My name's Dave Webb. I'm the director of Astute. And one of the things that we've been trying to do over the last few months or the last year is to spread information within the Institute and the wider school about who is doing what in order to try and encourage collaboration across the school. Because at least on paper, it looks like we have some good strengths in that kind of field. Now, we'd had a series of meetings ranging from quite large workshops down to little intimate show and tell events, and none of those are now possible in the lockdown. So casting around for an alternative, we're exploring a new format here, and I'm really pleased and very grateful, I have to say, to have Ed Sweeney, our Professor of Logistics and Systems, joining me for a short chat. And in fact, I invited him for a virtual beer. The beer is actually real. At least I've got a beer here. You got your beer? Good, good. And what are you drinking, Ed?
I've got a bottle of Old Speckled Hen here.
A classic.
I'm a long-standing member of the campaign for real ale, so I do like a drop of real ale occasionally. So I'm indulging one of my passions as we speak.
Excellent. Well, mine's Hobson's Brewery. We're actually writing a European project with them at the moment, so it's a bit of support for a potential partner.
That's very interesting because by pure coincidence, I was due to visit Hobson's on Monday of this week as part of one of our ERDF projects. And of course, the company visit was postponed for obvious reasons. So it's great. I'm delighted you're supporting one of our partner companies.
Well, this came out of one of our other ERDF company projects originally, of course. So yeah, that's great. I guess the first question to ask you is not a technical one, but how are you? And what are you doing to keep yourself sane in the lockdown?
Dave, thank you for asking, and thank you for inviting me to this unusual way of sharing our research interests. But I suppose first of all, I'm doing well. First of all, and thank you for asking. I'm probably temperamentally the most ill-suited person you could imagine to lockdown because I enjoy people's company, and I think around the school I'm probably known as being a fairly sociable person. But I've been amusing myself in various ways. But the most interesting one has been, I think, as you know, my regular evenings of opera streaming, because one of the things I really miss about the lockdown is being able to go to concerts and so on. And my wife, who happens to be a classical singer, and I have been indulging our passion for opera. So we've particularly been following the nightly free streams from the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, and it just so happens this week is a Donizetti week, so we watched a performance of Anna Bolena about Anne Boleyn last night, and tomorrow night there's an interesting one which is Roberto Devereux, which has a connection with one of my alma maters, that's Trinity College Dublin, because Robert Devereux was the Earl of Essex, and he actually became the second ever Chancellor of the University of Dublin. That's Trinity College, way back in the late Tudor period. So we look forward to that one tomorrow night. So we're finding ways of continuing to indulge various passions, which is good. But life is good, and I'm amazed really at how quickly we all managed to adapt to the new circumstances, and I do hope that some of the sort of good practices that we've developed we'll be able to continue on in the post-lockdown period, particularly in terms of the ability to get things done perhaps much more quickly than we tend to in normal times. So that's kind of good.
And more sustainably, of course.
More sustainably. Absolutely.
It's been quite interesting, the developments on a lot of the conferences where you can now attend for free without leaving your desk, which is very useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we mentioned a little while back ERDF projects, and we're both involved in one of those in the agri-tech sector. And Ed gave a very good workshop for that ERDF project a year or two ago now, which I attended, and I thought he cheated a little bit because he got the audience to tell him what his research topic was. So I'm not going to fall for that one again. So can you tell us, the people that are listening or watching, what you do and why it's important?
I mean, that workshop was interesting, Dave, because it was the ultimate example, I think, of the flipped classroom, as we call it. You know, so we got the participants to kind of answer the key questions. Okay, I work really in the area of supply chain logistics. So that raises the first question: what is a supply chain? And simply put, a supply chain is a group of entities, a group of companies typically, and collectively those companies will work towards satisfying a demand somewhere in the marketplace. So a supply chain will typically comprise companies such as manufacturers, distributors and logistics service providers, wholesalers, retailers, and so on. And the key thing really with that supply chain is you could have hundreds or perhaps thousands of companies, and the real trick is how they work in a collaborative and integrated way so that they can ultimately satisfy customer demand. So demand for products like a beer that we as consumers have, but doing that in a very cost-effective way. And very importantly, in 2020, doing so in an environmentally sustainable fashion as well. I guess the other way to think about this is if we look at the activities that take place within most organizations, certainly manufacturing-based organizations, we often talk about this idea of buying stuff, making stuff, moving stuff, storing stuff, and selling stuff. So that idea of buy, make, move, store, sell is a good way of thinking about the key functions or the key processes that typically are involved in satisfying a customer requirement. And you know, if there's one word in a sense which sums up everything that we're about, it's probably the word integration, because a lot of our traditional supply chain architectures were characterized by high levels of fragmentation. So that's fragmentation in terms of processes and fragmentation in terms of data. And we know very well from the documented research as well as from practical experience that this sort of fragmentation directly leads to inefficiencies, to waste, and so on. So in many ways, the sort of holy grail of supply chain management in 2020 is about facilitating that shift from fragmentation to much more integrated ways of doing things. And
Yeah.
I often joke to my students that I'm going to set an exam question, and the exam question asks, what is supply chain management? But you're only allowed one word to answer the question. And if that were the case, probably that one word would be the word integration. So that's what it's about. And it's an interesting field because it's multidisciplinary. It involves economic issues and management issues. Critically, it involves technology issues and engineering issues, because the biggest single facilitator of the integration to which I referred a few minutes ago is quite advanced technology, and the ERDF project to which you referred, I think, is a good example of cross-disciplinary collaboration, because you and your colleagues within the Aston Institute of Photonics Technology, for example, bring an incredibly deep knowledge of existing and emerging technologies that can support integration. And the team which I lead brings some expertise in terms of the effective deployment of that technology in a supply chain context. So technology is massively important in this whole space. I mean, the other key word probably is the word logistics. And we think of logistics really as being a subset of supply chain management. And it's that aspect of supply chain management which is fundamentally concerned with the physical movement and the physical storage of stuff. So if you go back to the buy, make, move, store, sell type logic, the logistics part really is about the move link and the store link. So my research and the team's research in Aston is fundamentally about the wider supply chain, giving the contextual piece, but much more detailed work on the logistics dimension of that. I mean, if I may, there's one other word which is important in this context, and it's the word systems. And to me, it's an important word because when we think about systems, particularly as engineers, we probably immediately and instinctively think about information systems. It is about information systems because, as I said before, information technology is a key enabler of integration, but it's about much more than that. It's about systems thinking. It's about trying to do things in a much more integrated and a much more joined up sort of fashion.
Yeah.
So all of our work is really about that in some shape or form.
Well, I think in your exam I might have got maybe a second class degree because I would have said the two words that I keep seeing when I'm looking at your stuff are systems and sustainability as well. You mentioned the green side of the topic. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's probably two kind of really big areas, big thematic areas that we have particularly strong focus on at Aston. One is about digital supply chains, so technology enhanced supply chains, and as an engineering school based logistics team, that's particularly important to us. And the second piece, which is important, as you say, is really about how can we do things in a much more environmentally sustainable fashion. I mean, we know that supply chain activities, including transportation, but not restricted to transportation, do considerable damage to the natural environment. So looking at how we can decarbonize logistics activities is a key focus of everything that we do, really.
Okay. We mentioned already the link to photonics that you or I are working on. I have to say, when I first heard about supply chain management, I would have pictured Eddie Stobart trucks and warehouses. But since becoming a bit more familiar with what you do, I now see robots, I see mathematical models. So how do you see your area being able to link into other areas of the school?
Well, I mean, if we return to the sort of two overarching thematic areas that are important to us, in fact, they match very, very well and align very well with the two existing university research institutes within the School of Engineering and Applied Science. So in terms of photonics, our link with photonics, including on the Agri project, which you mentioned previously, to me has a very strong focus on exactly that issue of how can we effectively deploy technology to enhance what we're doing. And of course, the other university research institute within our school is the one focused on energy and bioproducts. And again, we have a number of interesting collaborative projects with our colleagues in EBRI, focusing really on sustainability issues. That really started with looking at value chains within the bioenergy sector. So we've tried to become the sort of go-to people when it comes to looking at supply chains in that sector. But it raises much wider issues about how we can again deploy sort of technologies, for example, that were originally developed from an energy generation point of view, but how we can apply those in a transportation context. So I think in terms of alignment between logistics and supply chain and the two existing university research institutes, there's a clear alignment. But as you said, for example, one of the massive challenges that supply chain professionals face is this sort of big data conundrum. So like one of the interesting results of technology deployment across supply chains is we're collecting more and more data about a whole variety of different parameters right across the supply chain. So developments in technology have allowed us to do that, but it's left us with another problem, which is, what can we do with this data to transform it and convert it into something which is useful and usable from a management decision-making point of view. So we collaborate with colleagues in the computer science department, and we collaborate with mathematicians, and we've got some really strong resource in Aston, as you know, in those areas. And that's been a very fruitful collaboration, I think, and something we would like to build on. And the umbrella of Astute gives us a very good opportunity to do that, particularly when it comes to looking at logistics problems in urban settings, which has become a particular challenge for the industry, and therefore has become a key priority for us in terms of our research agenda.
Well, I know you mentioned urban area. I know at the moment you've got a focus on looking at urban transport, but not perhaps where people would conventionally focus, which is on transporting people, because that's where we usually see or encounter the problems ourselves. But you're looking at transportation, well, the white vans, if you like. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one, Dave, because traditionally our focus has very much been on the sort of trunking part of freight transportation, so the long distance stuff. And I think we've seen a lot of successes in that area, because there's a clear, there's a lot of evidence now that we've managed to decouple economic growth from growth in transportation activity on the long distance part of supply chains. I think we have an assumption for a long time that as economies grew, the amount of transportation, and therefore the amount of pollution, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, for example, would grow in a very highly correlated fashion. But we've managed to see economic growth continuing and a stabilizing of the amount of long distance transportation. However, we haven't seen the same thing with the so-called last mile piece. So when it comes to delivery of products to residential settings in urban areas, to shops and restaurants and other businesses, we've seen a massive growth in that the activity at that part of the supply chain. So I mean, if you walk around urban areas, you'll see a lot more white vans, as you mentioned, than perhaps we did previously. And this is borne out by the data at national level. For example, if you look at the number of LGVs, light goods vehicles, that have been registered in the last 10 years, it's grown enormously. Mm. And we perhaps lazily assumed that this was related principally to growth in online shopping and the attendant need for deliveries, often deliveries of very small volumes of products to people and to businesses in urban areas. But when we study that in a bit more detail, and we've done exactly this recently in collaboration with the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport and the RAC Foundation, what we discover is the situation is much more complex than perhaps it appears at first glance. So, for example, when we look at the white vans delivering stuff to businesses in city centres, a lot of the vehicles are service vehicles, so vehicles which are delivering components to support the repair and overhaul of utility systems. We see a lot of deliveries which relate directly or indirectly to construction type activity, as well as, of course, the vans which are delivering food and delivering other products to online consumers. So we still don't have a full picture and a clear picture of exactly the dynamics of that, but it's something we're developing a much better profile of through our research. But I mean, we do see, and I think it's a product of two things really. We've seen population growth globally, of course, but we've also seen massive increases in urbanization, and that's bringing new challenges for us in logistics. And again, I think Astute, with its focus on urban settings, is an excellent platform for us in terms of exploring these issues in a bit more detail.
I mean, that's interesting. Do you see at this stage any potential solutions? I mean, I guess from a pollution point of view, you can think about electrification or hydrogen or things like that, but you've still got the things on the road getting in the way.
Yeah, I think the reality is that the solution to this problem will never be one single thing. It's going to be a package of different types of interventions. I think the first thing will be to do with the actual vehicles themselves, so moving towards more sustainable propulsion. So we see a lot about electric, we see a lot more electric vans, for example, being used. We see things like e-cargo bikes. There's the other thing, and you alluded to this earlier. We tend to, and transport planners traditionally have tended to think about passenger transport and freight transport as two quite separate things. But with, if you like, a shared infrastructure, a shared road network, and so on. But we see a lot of scope for much more joined up thinking in terms of passenger transport and freight transport planning. For example, a lot of European cities now will use trams, which are principally designed for passengers, and you have dedicated compartments within tram carriages, which are for freight, for small items which are being delivered. We see scope, for example, in Birmingham for the use of inland waterways, for the use of our extensive canal network, perhaps to deal with this. But but the most important thing probably is looking at the whole way in which supply chains are structured. Our research tells us that a lot of the inefficiencies, a lot of the pollution, and a lot of the environmental degradation is a direct result of really poorly designed supply chains. So, for example, what some companies have been doing is creating urban consolidation centres and urban distribution centres at the edge of, kind of near ring roads, if you like, just on the outskirts of city centres, and that requires a whole rethink of the way in which the wider supply chain works. So I think it's likely to be a combination of different interventions which will provide the solution to these problems. There won't be just one thing; it will be a raft of different types of things.
I guess it comes back to your whole systems outlook that you can't really solve it by just one sticking plaster. You need to redesign the whole system, which is easy to say and difficult to do, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And because the system to which we refer comprises myriad stakeholders, all of which have their own commercial and other interests, and trying to come up with solutions which are truly holistic is probably the biggest single challenge. But it is we find it very encouraging that the policy making entities that we work with, so for example, Transport for West Midlands, which obviously is part of the West Midlands Combined Authority, and Midlands Connect, which covers a much bigger geographical area spanning the East and West Midlands. That whole idea of doing things in a more holistic way has become much more widely understood and more widely accepted. So I think that gives us a good basis to move things forward over the next few years.
Great. I'm feeling slightly guilty on two accounts here. Firstly, I sort of lured you in with the thought that this might be a 15-minute chat, and I should have known better than that, because whenever you and I talk, it seems to sort of roll on. And I also lured you in with the promise of a beer, which you then had to buy yourself. So I'll have to owe you the beer for later. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of very topical questions, if I may, to finish up. Somebody said, and it was probably you talking to me, that supply chain, you only notice it when it goes wrong. And if it had been a year or two ago, the example that would have come to mind was it Kentucky Fried Chicken, where they changed suppliers and suddenly they didn't have any chicken on time, and obviously that's when people notice the supply chain. But of course, in the last year, there's been a couple of areas where supply chain has come to prominence, and the first one was Brexit. And I guess my question is that the people making decisions, the ministers that are talking about Brexit, do you feel that they really understand the implications of the supply chains, which are, just in time, very lean these days? What's your view on that?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, first of all, in many ways, a good supply chain is an invisible supply chain, and it's often only when problems happen that we begin to take notice of the supply chains that we all are completely dependent upon. And you're right, if we go back to the summer of 2018, we had the Kentucky Fried Chicken story, and it's been a great source of case studies for those of us who teach about supply chain.
Every cloud has a silver lining.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also had that same summer during the World Cup, we remember the supply chain for CO2 collapse. And,
Yeah.
So we had the warmest summer on record, and pubs were running out of carbonated drinks, which was interesting. Yeah, I mean, on a more serious note, the Brexit debate, I think, put logistics and supply chain issues right at the forefront of national discourse in a sense, because those of us who work in the area recognize that we're very much at the vanguard of this, because we've heard a lot of stuff, for example, about frictionless trade. And we've done a lot of work looking at, for example, the implications of a no deal Brexit, and who knows what's coming along later this year. The impact is potentially catastrophic for a lot of supply chains that depend on this very lean, very global, and very just-in-time orientated sort of architectures. And in a sense, I think those supply chains haven't been developed overnight, and they haven't happened by accident. They've happened because over several decades, we've seen a progressive dismantling and reduction in the barriers that existed internationally in terms of the movement of product, particularly, but also the movement of information, the movement of people, the movement of knowledge, the movement of money. And Brexit potentially is very damaging to all of that. And certainly any form of Brexit will require companies with significant operations in the UK to radically rethink the way in which their supply chains are configured. And a lot of it really is about trying to understand how these material flows actually work, and if we put any blockages in the way of these relatively frictionless movements, what impact that's likely to have. And it's looking at the impact from 3 points of view, I think. It's looking at the impact from a cost point of view, of course, because we worry about delays, and delays cost money. Time is money. Secondly, we look at Brexit through the lens of timely delivery, particularly in a just-in-time context. I mean, a small delay in delivering product to a manufacturing plant can have a major knock-on effect elsewhere in these very interconnected global supply chains. And we also look at them now increasingly through a sustainability prism. So if we make product flows more difficult internationally because of Brexit or anything else, that can have a knock-on effect, not just in terms of cost and service, but also from an environmental point of view. So it's looking again at all of these things in the round and what they mean. I mean, our work with it's interesting because the COVID-19 situation has sort of relegated Brexit down the agenda somewhat, but it's still there as a major consideration for all of the companies that we work with. And the logistics industry itself has been grappling and with this and trying to develop sort of different ways of doing things in the face of various possible eventualities. But the biggest single problem, I think, is the lack of certainty about what's going to happen. If we knew exactly what the rules of the trading game would be, for example, at the end of December this year, we could plan accordingly. But the problem over the last few years is a huge amount of uncertainty. Uncertainty means planning is difficult. Difficulties in planning mean that almost inevitably investment decisions, for example, get put on hold, and all of that potentially makes our supply chains much more fragile. So this, despite the fact that we don't hear about Brexit too much at the moment for obvious reasons, it's still a massive issue for us, and one that we will have to grapple with as time passes.
Somehow.
Somehow, yeah.
Yeah. So we can't really finish without turning to the coronavirus epidemic, which we're in the middle of, and is ultimately responsible for this conversation, I guess, in some ways. We've heard a lot again about logistics relating to PPE in the last few months. Early on, they said there was plenty of stock, and the problem seemed to be getting it to the front line. We've also heard about UK companies offering to make stuff or offering stock and them being ignored, and now we're sending planes to Turkey and China. Do you think at this stage, and of course, things are still developing and we won't have the whole story till the end, but can you see lessons that we might learn already, or is the situation still too early for that?
I think we're learning, every day we're learning new things, really, Dave. I mean, if we go back to the sort of beginning of this, and it feels like ages ago, but I mean, as recently as late February, and it's late April now, the biggest concern we had in supply chains was disruption to global supply chains, which had a strong Chinese link in the chain. So, for example, the media in late February and into March was carrying stories about Jaguar Land Rover executives flying back from Wuhan with suitcases full of critical components. That, that was kind of our major concern to begin with. As things moved on, we began to focus a lot on the impact of COVID-19 on food supply chains, because you remember we had this incredible spike in demand for food products because people began to stockpile in advance of the expected lockdown. And at one point, the British Retail Consortium, around the middle of March, estimated that the biggest single warehouse in the UK wasn't one of the big sheds down in the Golden Triangle, so-called, in the East Midlands. It was actually people's fridges and freezers and cupboards. We reckoned that we had about £1 billion worth of stock sitting in people's houses as a direct result of this sort of stockpiling and panic buying. And the reality is that supply chains just are not designed to cope with massive spikes in demand like that. Now, of course, things calm down a little bit, and I think those supply chains, those food supply chains particularly, have proven to be remarkably resilient. But our attention then began to move to the supply chain feeding stuff into the health service. So we've heard a lot about PPE, and we have serious problems in that regard. The one that I think is center stage at the moment, as we begin to think about the exit strategy from all of this, is really around testing capability. And we hear stories this week. Well, the health secretary has an objective of 100,000 tests per day by tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, which looks very ambitious. But the truth is that I think any exit strategy from this is very, very dependent on ramping up testing capability. And as things stand, we simply do not have a supply chain which is robust enough to deliver that capability. So I think a big focus over the next few weeks is going to be about putting that sort of infrastructure and the associated systems into place. So it's been interesting over the last few weeks that our focus has sort of shifted around, high-tech automotive supply chains to food and into PPE and medical supply chains. There have been a few fascinating and positive things which have emerged as well. And the one I'm thinking of particularly is the speed with which we managed to put these Nightingale hospitals.
Incredible.
And the one down at the Excel Centre in London was put into place from a standing start in like just about a week. And I mean, that's a hell of a logistics success, really. And it's not surprising to me that the NHS supply chain people working collaboratively with the private sector and, interestingly, with the armed forces played a big role in this. And in many ways, logistics was invented by the military. So
yeah, they have to do things quickly or else they lose. Yeah.
Yeah, the Royal Logistic Corps in the army and so on. But to me, the really positive lesson from that was we managed to put those facilities into place very quickly, mainly because we developed incredibly collaborative models. So you had health service people, military people, commercial logistics firms working very closely together with a very clear objective, and we managed to achieve great things. So I'm hoping that some of those lessons from that we can take with us as we begin to see the restrictions lifted a little bit over the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, yeah. As you make a good point, it's not just having enough tests, but it's being able to get the tests to the people that need it, which is a entirely different but equally important challenge. Yeah.
It is, and it requires, like, it's to achieve that, you've got to really optimize this very complex network of different organizations, all of which play an important role in that delivery.
Okay, I'm conscious time's getting on. Let me just draw this to a conclusion with a completely different question. You're a very experienced academic here, so what would your advice be to a new academic? Can you think of any words of wisdom as a closing remark?
Yeah, I think something I've written down on my notes here is I think it's important that we certainly in the field I work in, which is a very application orientated field, that we bring into our careers some industry experience. You've probably heard me talking before about this idea of T-shaped people, and the idea of developing T-shaped people is something which informs the development of all of our education programs.
Yeah.
At undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and I think that lesson is important in the academic profession as well, because I think there's a danger that we focus too much on the vertical part of the team. So and of course we need experts, we need boffins, we need people who've got deep knowledge of their particular areas of expertise. But I don't think we should do that at the expense of that wider knowledge and understanding, because I think if we're to have a good chance of effectively using that deep knowledge, that vertical part of the T, we need that horizontal part as well. So and I know in some of our doctoral training centres, for example, we're placing a lot more emphasis now on developing more rounded, for example, PhD graduates. And I would urge anybody who's contemplating a career in academia to focus not just on developing that deep knowledge. That's massively important, of course it is, but alongside that, developing that wider knowledge of the context in which that deep knowledge needs to be applied.
That's a very good point, and it's actually a difficult challenge, isn't it? Because we're all under a lot of pressure to perform, whether it's as a senior academic or a PhD student, and so the temptation is always to work on that central pillar and make it deeper and longer. But you need, as you say, you need to be able to relate it to other things ultimately.
Well, I think so, Dave, and I think, again, going back to Astute, I think this is massively important in the context of Astute, because we have a very, very diverse range of backgrounds. If we look at the academic staff who form the core of Astute, we've got engineers of various hues, we've got scientists, we've got data people, and I think for these people to work effectively together, again, you need that. You need that sort of horizontal part of the T, because without that, I think multidisciplinary work that cuts across traditional boundaries becomes almost impossible. So, and I think the real breakthroughs in all of our fields are increasingly going to be based on effective collaboration across different disciplines.
Great. Well, I hope this conversation can play a little part, perhaps, in establishing more of a T-shaped structure across the Institute. So let me thank you very much again, Ed, for joining me today, and cheers.
Cheers. Good health to you, and thank you very much for inviting me.